Okay, everyone, here's the overview for Chapter 7. And I'm going to start with the Brown versus Board of Education decision because it is one of the landmark cases that we saw in the 50s and 60s and, in the latter half of the 20th century. They really did shape or change the way that society began to operate. And this case, Brown versus Board of Education, was brought on behalf of Linda Brown and her family, her parents. Linda Brown was a young girl. I believe she was in second grade at the time, elementary school. She lived near a white school, but she was forced to go to the school across town that was the black school. And so the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, brought a lawsuit against the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, arguing that segregating these children in the way that was being done in Topeka, Kansas was a violation of their constitutional rights, also that it violated the edict that had been set down in the Plessy versus Ferguson case in 1896. You may recall from earlier chapters that Plessy versus Ferguson was the Supreme Court case that said if states, local entities want to separate people by race, they can do that as long as they have created equal facilities. So that clause, separate but equal, became the catchphrase throughout the South because that meant that now the Supreme Court had said, hey, you can segregate people by race as long as you create these equal facilities. Well, of course, things were rarely equal, and hence 58 years later, this case was brought before the U.S. Supreme Court. Thurgood Marshall was a young lawyer who argued the case for the NAACP. He later went on to be appointed the first black Supreme Court justice of the United States. And one of the pieces of evidence that Thurgood Marshall presented to the court was some research that had been done by Drs. Kenneth and Mamie Clark. These were two social psychologists, husband and wife, who lived in I believe it was New York or somewhere up in the north. And they had heard their whole lives about the prejudice and discrimination that were so virulent in the South. And so after World War II, they set out to conduct a study regarding or trying to understand what does it do to a child's psyche, to their self-image, to the way they think about themselves. What does it do when from a very young age you've heard almost nothing but negative things about who you are from the larger society? And so their study was rather simple by today's standards, I suppose, but effective nonetheless. The research consisted of showing children two dolls, one black and one white, and of course they were using I don't know what their real names are, but they're called doll babies, those dolls that look like babies. And one of them was white and the other was white also, but they had used shoe polish to make it darker skinned, to make it appear as though it was a darker skinned baby. And then, of course, after getting waivers and parents' consent and all that other good stuff, they brought children in one by one and asked them a series of questions. And they asked fairly simple questions, questions that first and second graders could understand. And they asked things such as which baby is the prettier baby, or which baby is the one that white people like the best, or which baby is the one that black people like the best, which baby would you like to look like, etc. And after traveling throughout the South and collecting all this data, they wrote up their research, and what they concluded was that even at very young ages, children are already beginning to internalize negative ideas about themselves, and that became part of their self-identity. Because according to their research, children overwhelmingly chose the white doll as the one that was more intelligent, that was prettier, that was the one that people liked better, or the best, that they would like to look most like, etc. And the black baby was viewed more negatively by the majority of the children. And so, based on this research, doctors Kenneth and Mamie Clark concluded that living in the South was detrimental to the psyche and the self-identity of young black children. And so the court, looking at this and this evidence and other evidence, posed the question, and you see it there in quotes, does segregation of children in public schools solely on the basis of race deprive the children of the minority group of equal educational opportunities? We believe that it does. So there the court is essentially asking the question, when we segregate children solely because of how they look, their race, does that mean then that those children are deprived of equal educational opportunities? And the court said, we believe that it does. When we do that, we believe that it does deprive these children of an equal educational opportunity. We also conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. This case struck down that whole idea of separate but equal, and not just in education, in all other public institutions as well. And so, again, it's a seminal or landmark case that really did change the way that we think about education today. Now, it wasn't overnight. Next morning, whites didn't get up and welcome black children into their schools. Of course, that didn't happen. It was a lengthy process, and there's information in the textbook about some of the steps that people in southern states, particularly the legislators in southern states, took to try to prevent the integration of schools. It wasn't pretty. So I want you to consider that Brown versus Board of Education, come 2024, it will be 70 years since that decision. And yet we still see inequality in education. We don't intentionally segregate children anymore, and yet children are just as segregated as they ever were. Okay? And we'll take a little bit about why that might be. Okay, so here's that CNN clip that I put in there for you if you want to take a look at it on your own time. There's some of the information that was in the text you can take a look at. I want to point to some of the disparity that we see in terms of why education is still so segregated today. And one of the things that we know to be true is that neighborhoods are segregated. So we tend to go to the school that is closest to us, which means that if we've got a low-income neighborhood and the majority of families in that low-income neighborhood are African American or Latinx, then the school you go to is still going to be largely segregated. And we see that throughout LA. When I taught in LA, I don't anymore. Everything I do now is remote. But when I taught in LA, I used to teach what we call dual enrollment courses at some of the local high schools around East LA College, which was where my full-time job was. And I'd go to Roosevelt High School primarily, but I sometimes also went out to Garfield High School. Both these places are in East LA. And they still look like they did in the 1960s. That is, predominantly Latinx communities, therefore predominantly Latinx schools, and still the same rundown facilities, still the same outdated textbooks. You know, it's almost as though I was walking back into the early 1970s. because not a whole lot had changed. Okay, and so I put a few clips in there. The one, the TED Talk, that's actually your discussion for this week. But there's also one about how schools are funded, as well as one about educational inequality at, at, at Harvard. Hold on, let me get back to there we go. All right, so sorry about that. I want you to take a look at this graph. Now this is, older information for sure. It only goes through 2011, but you can see that the percentage of African American students in majority white Southern schools began to go up by the mid 1960s. And during the late 1960s, all the way through the 70s, it continued to go up. It then began to plateau here in the 80s, well, late 70s through the early 80s, went back up a bit in the mid 80s, and then has steadily fallen since then. Okay. And again, for a lot of people who study this issue, they believe a lot of it has to do with the economic inequality of neighborhoods, and just people simply being priced out of neighborhoods where the schools are better, and so they have to go and live in communities where they can afford, which tend to be lower income. I also want you to consider how, let me get through this here, this isn't what I want. Okay, this one I want. I also want you to consider how, when we think about economic inequality, it is not something that we can fix overnight. Certainly raising the minimum wage to a living wage would go a long way toward helping. The child tax credit that will be in effect for about a year or so, unless Congress passes a larger bill to fund it. Poverty is a difficult thing to overcome. Not only do you have you have less access to resources, but you also typically have access to education that is substandard. And I don't want you to misunderstand me. I am not suggesting that it is the fault of people who live in low-income neighborhoods, or that it is the fault of people who work at schools in low-income neighborhoods. I don't think that at all. People are working with in those schools, people are working with limited resources. And if you watch the video on how California schools are funded, what you recognize is the reason those schools are so poorly funded is because in low-income areas, there are more renters than there are homeowners. So yes, there are apartment buildings, and yes, the person who owns that apartment building does pay property taxes. However, if, let's say, 50 families live in well, maybe not 50, let's say 20 families live in a rental unit with 20 apartments, that means there are 20 families who are not paying property tax, versus a higher income community, middle or income or above. The majority of places to live in those communities are single family homes. Maybe a townhouse, maybe a duplex here and there, but they're typically single family homes. So every family in that neighborhood is paying taxes. Therefore, there's more money going to schools versus that lower income neighborhood. And what I want you to check out here, again, it's older information, sure. You've got the newer one, this is the older slide. But what you notice is that, well, if you have the ebook, you have the newer slide. Asian Pacific Islander bachelor's degrees or higher were fairly steady until the mid 1990s. And then they slowly went up a bit and seem to have peaked somewhere around the early 2000s to around 2007, 8, somewhere around there, went down a bit, then went back up, down, but they haven't gone really below 40% here. However, when you look at these other groups, for example, Latinx individuals, their rate of attainment and earning of a bachelor's degree has remained fairly stagnant, that is fairly unchanged. It's gone up and down a little bit, but not appreciably. The same thing is true for African American or Black students, fairly stagnant throughout the last, from 1990 to 2005, went up a little bit in the mid-2000s and then back down a little bit and then back down. Again, not an appreciable difference. And we've only been, since about 2002, 3, looking at students who identify as 2 or more races. That's the green line here. Again, a little bit up and down, but nothing appreciably increasing. And then, of course, you look at African American or American Indian and Alaskan Native. They're this color here, and we only have numbers starting around 2002, 3, something like that. Huge, well, not a huge, but a slight jump, then going back down, then a jump, and then coming up and down, and then up. Again, not a whole lot of movement there. So what we're seeing is that over this 23-year period, education in terms of the attainment or earning of a bachelor's degree or higher by folks of color hasn't really changed a whole lot, despite the fact, and I really feel like I need to point this out, that there has been an increase in the number of programs that are offered across the nation at all levels of colleges and universities, from community colleges to state universities to university equivalent UCs, to private schools. All these schools are offering many, many more programs to assist first-generation students, and we're still not seeing a real appreciable difference for these students. So the question is, why might that be? That's for another class, though. I have ideas, but that's for another class. All right, so let me go to the role of economics here. Again, thinking about how the family we're born into has a lot to do with our life chances, with our opportunities, with our access to resources. It's no surprise here that students who have highly educated parents tend to be in wealthier families. Parents are wealthier because they have more education, and those parents can assist their kids. The parents who've gone to college themselves can assist their teens with writing personal statements, with applying for college financial aid, the FAFSA, if they even need it. I mean, if they're really wealthy families, they might not need it at all. They know what to do to help their teen get into a better school. They know about the difference between extracurricular and co-curricular activities. They know that's going to summer camp and doing internships. You know, all of these things will increase the chances of their child going to a better quality institution. Parents who are not college educated, they don't know this information. They lack this information. So it's not that they're trying to dissuade or to prevent their children from going to a college. It's they just don't know how to help their children because they don't have that information. I want us to think about how our families help us. There are 2 things here, cultural capital and social capital. And cultural capital is described as being the sum total of all of the knowledge of the established cultural and social practices within the society that a person lives. So, for example, knowing the difference between co-curricular and extracurricular activities, and knowing that being involved in both of these things will help you get into the college of your choice. That's part of cultural capital. It's part of the society that we live in that values kids being involved both outside of school as well as at school. Another part of cultural capital is knowing people who are already engaged in professions that the child might be interested in. That means that a person can be introduced more to that profession because that family friend or that relative can take them to their workplace and show them what they do. And I have an example of this. She's fortunate because she's and I love when this happens. One of my former colleagues at East LA College has a daughter who I believe is now in her third year of medical school. And this colleague is Latinx. She and her husband are from the east side of LA. They went to Cal State LA. She earned her bachelor's and master's there. He became a firefighter. The husband became a firefighter. They had 2 kids. And the daughter is in medical school now. Now, part of the reason why the daughter believed that she could do this is because in Take Your Daughters to Work Day, one year, I was told by my friend, this former colleague, that her daughter asked, and because she'd been going with her mom to the workplace, and so she asked her mom, I think it was 5th grade or so, if instead she could go to work with a friend of her mother's who was a woman who is a pediatrician. And her mom thought, yes, that was a great idea. And so this woman took my colleague's daughter to her workplace. She worked at a hospital, children's hospital near downtown LA, very well-known hospital. And the daughter spent the day with her there. After that, the daughter became convinced she wanted to be a doctor. And so the parents were able to, because they, at least the mom, had gone to college and earned a bachelor's and master's, and of course the father very supportive, and then they have this family friend who's a doctor who helps in every way she can. The young woman becomes a medical student. Okay, that's the kind of thing that not everybody has. Not everybody has that kind of cultural capital. Social capital is different. It is how we are connected to others in that network of people. And by being connected to those other individuals, we may have access to some of the resources that they have. So here's an example of social capital. I don't have any kids, but pretend that I had a kid. Let's say one day my kid is in the junior year of college and summer's coming along and my kid says, hey, I think I want to go to law school. And so I say to my kid, well, you should probably work at a law firm for the summer to see if you even like being around lawyers, and maybe you'll pick up a thing or two about the practice of law. And so let's say I contact several of my friends who work in law firms, and I say to them, hey, my daughter is in her junior year, going to be finishing it. Next year is her senior year. She's thinking she'd like to go to law school. Does your firm offer any internships? And let's say a few of my friends say, yeah, have her send her resume to me and I'll forward it to the committee that hires interns for the summer. And lo and behold, my kid gets an internship with the law firm. Well, that's me using my social capital so my daughter can have an advantage. So social capital and cultural capital are both a big part of what we get from being within our families. Yes, of course, we get love and care and nurture, and those are beautiful, wonderful things too. But some people get this extra, the cultural and the social capital. All right, so let's take a look at these. Okay, so cultural bias of standardized tests. Not everybody agrees with this concept, but the basic idea is this. That standardized test, which you've all taken, the SAT or the standardized test that you took K through 12, well, I think they only started in second grade, but we all know these tests. They're tests that are supposed to be fair because they're standardized, right? They're made so that everybody has an equal opportunity to do well on these, at least in theory. However, there is research that points to the idea that these tests are created by people who tend to come from the dominant group. They tend to come from a certain social class. Therefore, kids who come from the same social class and perhaps even the same ethnic group as the people who create the test are likely to going to do better than kids who don't come from that same background. So here's just a quick example of this. I want you to think of those matching word choice things, you know, the ones where people, you have to match one word with the word that matches it the best. So for example, the word might be cup, and then you get 4 choices: saucer, fork, knife, and plate. And so you have to choose the thing that matches the best with it. Well, we all know cup and saucer. Pretty simple. However, not so simple. I remember this one because I got it wrong. I got it wrong on a test. And I remember this one because I was in second grade and my teacher, as she handed back my paper, that was the only one I got wrong, said, "I can't believe you got that one wrong." Now, to be honest with you, I come from a family that was fairly poor. There were 9 kids, 2 parents, 11 of us. My parents were immigrants from Mexico. They were farm workers originally. And so when we drank coffee or any kind of hot beverage, it wasn't out of a cup with a saucer. It was out of a mug. I still drink out of mugs today. I'm not a cup and saucer person. Um, and so when I was taking that test as a second grader and I saw a cup, you know, the only cup I could think of was the kind we, you know, drank water or juice from. That was a cup. But I knew a plate wasn't the answer. I knew that a fork wasn't the answer. I knew knife wasn't the answer, but I also didn't know what a saucer was. And the only thing that I knew of in terms of saucers were flying saucers, because in the 1950s and 60s, you know, things from outer space, there were lots of TV shows about things from outer space, and so I knew about flying saucers. So none of those words made sense to me, so I just randomly chose one of them, and I got it wrong. I later went home and I looked up the word in the dictionary and realized, oh, okay, so that's what a saucer is. And so that's just one example of how, if you don't come from a certain background, you may not think in the same way as the person who created the test, which means that you might not get as many things correct as you would if you came from the same background as the person who made the test. Cultural imperialism is another idea. Again, not everybody agrees with it, but the idea here is that because educational systems were created for dominant group culture, that is, they were created for whites, they're still founded or based upon that structure all these many years later. And so there's not a whole lot of an attempt to include the culture of other groups in the educational process. Now, granted, that is changing and has changed. But I think we still continue to teach things, particularly K through 12, that are from the dominant group perspective. And in an earlier chapter, you were asked to think about the kind of history that you were taught, the history of the United States, and how that teaching of history differs from some of the things that you've been learning in this class, or maybe some of your other classes. All right, I just really briefly want to cover this concept, this idea It's called the model minority myth. And often in this country, Asians, Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, they're believed to be the model minority, um, meaning that people look to these groups and say, look, they come here, they work hard, they make sure their kids do well in school, their kids go to college, and then they're able to contribute to American society and make a good living and help their parents. And so why can't all these other um, groups be like them? You know, they're the model minority. Other groups should model themselves after these groups. And of course, this is demeaning not only to Asian Americans, Asians, Pacific Islanders, etc. It's also demeaning to other groups of color, other immigrant groups, because not all groups come to the United States with the same degree of education, the same types of resources. Some people come to the United States with more resources, with more education than other groups. For example, yes, people of Chinese ancestry, Korean ancestry, Japanese ancestry, they do tend to earn degrees from higher educational institutions at high numbers, higher even sometimes than some Caucasian groups. However, that's not true of all Asian Pacific Islander groups. Some of these groups come here with far fewer advantages than those other groups. In addition to that, Korean American, Japanese American, Chinese American, some of those families have been here for quite a few generations, whereas other immigrants from these countries are much newer immigrants. And so it isn't really fair to either people who are Asian, Asian American, Pacific Islander, to compare them to more recent immigrants, but it is also not fair to compare these groups to other groups of color that are immigrants. So just, want to put that out there that most people think of this as a fairly demeaning idea, this model minority idea. Imposter syndrome is one that, to me, is very relevant. I didn't know this term when I was in college, but I felt it. I just didn't have a name for it, and now all these years later I do. Imposter syndrome is referencing the idea that for some students, particularly first generation students who come from historically marginalized backgrounds, they may experience this feeling that maybe they really don't belong where they are. There's a sense of insecurity about whether or not we really belong at the institution where we are or belong in the job that we're in. I felt this often when I was at Stanford, particularly at the beginning of my 5 years there, and less as time went on. But there were times, every now and then, when I still felt it. Excuse me, let me drink some water. And so this idea that, maybe I really am not smart enough to be here. I felt that at Stanford when I first got there. It seemed that everybody else had gone to much better schools than I had gone to. They knew things that I did not know. I went to a public school, and granted, I was in, the college track of my high school, and I did graduate. I think it was number 4 out of 350, something like that, so fairly high, toward the top. But we didn't have AP courses. I didn't even know what AP courses were until I got to Stanford. We just didn't have them. And so these were people who had already read some of the texts that the philosophy texts that we were reading in our first year of Western civilization. And so I sometimes thought, wow, what am I doing here? Am I really even smart enough to be here? But I also didn't want anybody else to know what I was thinking, to know that I was insecure about being at Stanford. And so imposter syndrome is very real for some first-generation students. Stereotype threat. There's a video here that you should check out. It's also discussed in the text, so I'll leave that for you to look at. And then role of schools. Okay, so I think I'm finished here. I just wanted to go again over some tracking and Pygmalion effect. Okay, but 2 more things. Tracking. Tracking is something that probably all major school districts do. Probably even some of the smaller ones do it too. Tracking is when schools divide students into different groups based upon what are perceived to be their abilities and skills. So the typical tracks are these. They're either called college prep or high achieving or GATE, gifted and talented education, I think it is in California. So those are the high achievers. That's one track. The middle track is often just called the middle track or the average track. And then the lower achieving track is another one. These are students who don't quite do as well as they could to be able to be in that middle track. And then there are the students who may have learning differences, and so those students maybe go into another track. That's different from the kids who are considered to be just not as intelligent. And so those kids, though, who are in the learning differences track, they're intelligent, they just need those accommodations. So here's the idea. The idea is that by putting kids into these different tracks and grouping them according to their skills and abilities, it means that children can learn better because they're with kids that are at their same pace. However, the downside is that when you look at who's placed into these different tracks, whites and Asians tend to be placed in the higher tracks, whereas African Americans, Latinx individuals, and Native Americans are disproportionately assigned to the lower tracks. And I've been told stories by students over the years of their own stories or their stories of people they knew or relatives, people who were placed in the wrong track. And particularly this happened with kids who were placed into the ESL track, even though they didn't need to be there because they spoke English in addition to Spanish, or they primarily spoke English and only very little Spanish. How do these kids get placed there? They weren't given a language test. It was because of their last name. Okay. And so if you're a kid like myself, and by the way, they didn't have ESL back when I was a kid because everybody just was supposed to know English. But had there been ESL, I probably would have been put into one of those courses, and I probably would have done terribly because I didn't know Spanish as a child. I didn't learn Spanish until high school because I took it in high school. My parents didn't teach us Spanish because they didn't want us to have accents. They thought that having an accent when we spoke English would be a bad thing. Pygmalion effect is the other thing I want to go over. Pygmalion effect is this idea, and it's been replicated over and over again in research. It's the idea that the way that a teacher interacts with his or her students has a profound effect on student achievement. And I've listed some movies that you might have seen. Probably the only 2 that maybe you've seen are Freedom Riders and Dangerous Minds, and all these movies are old. I think the newest one was Freedom Riders, and that was made in like 2002, 2003, something around there. So maybe you've never heard of any of them. But if you ever want, you can check them out. Probably they're on Netflix or whatever streaming service you use. Here's the idea. If a teacher interacts with his or her students in such a way that the teacher is motivating the students and challenging the students and setting high standards for the students, research has found that most of those students will rise to the level of expectations. And remember, it's not just that the teacher has these high expectations, but that the teacher also tries motivating these kids, challenging these kids, and helps these kids to reach those high expectations. There is also the opposite effect, though. A teacher who interacts with his or her students such that the students clearly know this teacher thinks they're big dummies, doesn't think that they're worth the time and effort to try to teach them, sets low standards or maybe no standards, those students also rise to or sink to the lower levels of teacher expectancy. And so in those three movies that are based on real life situations in real schools, in each of those instances, the teacher was, a new teacher was put into a course with kids who were the low achieving kids. In some instances, these kids were kids who had bad attitudes, they talked back to the teacher, etc., etc. However, these teachers didn't believe that these kids were dumb. These teachers in these three instances decided that these kids just hadn't had anyone believe in them. And so they set about making sure that they earned the trust and respect of these kids. And they set high standards and they helped these kids to achieve those high standards. And in each one of these instances, those kids went from being low achieving kids to being fairly high achieving kids. And the one that I saw, the first one, is called Stand and Deliver. It's based on a real life situation that happened at Garfield High School in East LA. A math teacher, a high school math teacher, Escalante was his name. He was a new teacher. Well, he had a previous career as an engineer. And so he decided to start teaching. And so he was assigned to Garfield High School. One of his classes was a group of low achieving kids. And these kids hated school, didn't want to learn, told them they weren't going to learn. And some of these kids could barely do, basic math. And yet he took them over 3.5 years, because he had them as high school freshmen. Over 3.5 years, he worked with these kids to the point where here they are in their senior year of high school. Now they're taking AP Calculus, and they take the AP exam, and they all earn a 5. 11 of these kids take an AP test in calculus, and they all earn a 5. Well, the Educational Testing Service, the ETS, which creates all of these AP tests, figured that 11 kids, brown kids, from East LA, a high school in East LA, could not all have earned 5. They must have cheated. Maybe their teacher helped them. Somehow, some way they cheated. It couldn't be true that all these kids scored a 5. So they invalidated the test results and told the kids they'd have to take it over again, which they did. And again, they earned 5, all of them. Proving, of course, that they didn't cheat, but that they were in fact smart and could actually earn the 5 on those tests. The ETS did not apologize. They simply said, okay, well, your score stands as a 5. Again, the racism and the prejudice, thinking that brown kids from a poor school couldn't all earn a 5. All 11 of them couldn't earn a 5. Same thing is true in the other instances there in the movies listed. Okay, so that's where I'm going to end it. Make sure that you read the rest of the text and take a look at some of the resources that I put in the module to try to highlight educational inequality in the United States. I'll see you for Chapter 8 overview.